This is a joint effort between WRI, We Mean Business, and UN Global Compact. A pretty impressive group here that we've got on the webinar, and anxious to get into some questions. But let me hand it off to Heidi Husko from UN Global Compact to give us a quick introduction and welcome. Heidi, are you there? You may be on mute.
Thank you so much, Elliot, for the introduction, and welcome everyone. We're excited to this week have launched the Ambition Loop paper, and the timing is quite important. Earlier on this October, the IPCC special report really states that the world has already warmed by 1 degree due to human activity, and without serious action, the world's average surface temperature is likely to surpass by 3 degrees this century. And at the same time, countries are looking at their NDCs, and businesses are also committing to various corporate public commitments. To date, more than 2,430 businesses worldwide have made commitments towards the Paris Agreement. So the good news is really that it is still possible to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees, but it will take unprecedented changes in all aspects of society, in key sectors, and also in the way that companies and governments have dialogues with each other. And through the action platform at the UN Global Compact on pathways to low carbon and resilient development, together with WRI and We Mean Business, we've been working closely with companies to work on this concept of ambition loops, building on the guidance on responsible corporate engagement in climate policy that came out a few years ago, as well as on the trends that we see that companies are taking more and more action and looking into how this can reinforce also the policy changes that needs to happen. I will introduce today's speakers as well. I won't go too much else into the background. I think we should spend most time on hearing about the Ambition Loop. We have together with us today Jen Austin, who is the policy director at We Mean Business, and We Mean Business is a coalition of civil society business organizations working to make a change on climate change topics. And we have Elliot Metzger, who is a senior associate at Business Center at WRI, and WRI has been the research partner in this project. We also hear from Miguel Munoz Rodriguez, who is the head of climate policies at Iberdrola, and who has been part of giving input to this process throughout. We will also hear from David Wasco, who is the International Climate Director at WRI, and he will tell us more about the priorities that we are looking at COP24 and what is about to happen there. And myself, I'm Heidi Husko, I'm a senior manager at the UN Global Compact, and pleasure to have so many of you joining today. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Jen, who will start to conceptualize the Ambition Loop for you.
Thank you, Heidi. Hi, everybody. Thank you all so much for joining us for this discussion today of our new report, The Ambition Loop. And this is a report that looks at how leadership in the private sector and government policy leadership can build on each other, how they can reinforce each other, and together accelerate the pace of change on climate action. As we speak, hundreds of the world's largest and leading businesses from industries and sectors all around the world are pursuing bold climate action. At the same time, countries are working on their long-term strategies for full decarbonization. They're looking at updating their national climate plans in advance of 2020 and preparing to take the next steps towards meeting the goals of the Paris Agreement. Brought together, the opportunity for greater ambition is enormous. As Heidi mentioned, as the recent IPCC 1.5 report, last week's US National Climate Assessment, and others have made ever more clear, there's no time to waste. and creating ambition loops can help speed us towards the solution. We know that more and more businesses are seeing the opportunity in the zero carbon economy and are taking action on climate change. This report contains many examples of the emerging and growing business leadership that we're seeing around the world. We have 150 companies, over 150 companies committed to 100% renewable energy. Their collective demand is equal to that of the energy use in Poland. We have companies around the world committing to 100% electric vehicle purchases and usage. The auto manufacturers themselves have announced over 150 billion in investments in low carbon vehicles. Industries from all over the world are committing to huge increases in energy efficiency. Hundreds of businesses are aligning the entirety of their operations with the Paris Agreement by setting science-based emissions targets. All of this action leads to increasing commercial demand and increasing business investment in climate solutions. And businesses and governments need to use this as a strong vote of confidence in support of their efforts to advance more ambitious policies. The policies that provide companies then with the clarity and confidence that they need to do even more. And this, in a nutshell, is the ambition loop, a positive feedback loop in which bold business leadership supports bold policy action that in turn accelerates further business action. The ambition loops can drive progress on national economic objectives, open and drive bigger markets, market opportunities, and help accelerate progress across the board on climate. When we look at the ambition loop here, we see how leadership on one side reinforces leadership on the other. And for governments, the push comes from and support comes from leading businesses, with companies helping to demonstrate commercial and economic possibilities, and that the corporate climate action and advocacy can lend political and economic support to governments' efforts, both to deliver on their existing goals and to advance new, bolder targets and policies. On the business side, the push comes from the long-term, clear, consistent government policies that help them understand the direction they're going. Bold targets and strong policies provide the clarity and confidence needed to invest in new market opportunities, helping companies also achieve their targets faster and incentivizing more and more companies to take action. For both, the loop continues as that strength builds on itself. Leadership begets leadership in this model, and we know that each needs to push and reinforce the other. Our Ambition Loop report looks at 3 sectors specifically. It looks at power, transportation, and land, and it highlights examples of where building on business leadership, strong national policy measures have then helped to spur additional investment and action by businesses, and that together those are accelerating the transition towards a prosperous zero carbon economy. In each case, you can go to the next slide here, in each case, the policies that provide clarity and confidence have been key. That's sort of a theme that we see throughout the examples. Businesses are looking for bold targets, regulatory certainty, clear timelines, and the report contains a number of perspectives from businesses on these examples of where and how these clear policies have helped inform and drive their decisions on climate, and have pointed to types of policies that they would like to see more of in key sectors to be able to do more. You can go to the next slide again. I'm going to talk for a minute about the sort of ultimate clarity of zeros and hundreds and how and 0 and 100 type targets. And the journey that we have embarked on here involves really charting a clear path to a full transition to a zero carbon future. And getting there means a complete transformation, including policies that provide clear time-bound targets towards achieving a full transition, towards 100% zero carbon power, towards 100% zero carbon transport, towards a real understanding on what the last date is going to be for the sale of an internal combustion engine car, or where the last coal plant, and a clear plan for real net zero emissions. And that these are the things that give the ultimate clarity on to be able to really invest decisively in the future. And importantly, when it's a 100% transition, there's no one sitting there thinking, oh, I'm the other small percent, or I'm the other guy. I'm in that small group that doesn't need to change. Everyone recognizes they need to be a part of the solution. And this discussion and thought about a full transition really helps inspire truly transformational thinking and innovation. People know we're not tinkering around the edges, that in fact, we're designing the businesses and industries of the zero carbon future. And that clarity and confidence of direction and pace of change starts to get people excited, involved, and thinking creatively. The full transition, it involves work in all of these sectors and more. This report is focused on these 3. And what we'll say is that, policymakers have many levers. They're able to set targets, They also have ambitious implementing policies that underlie that set the rules and incentives and direction. And so there's a lot of examples of ways in which this comes through and needs to be tailored for different circumstances in different places. But again, the thing that comes out over and over again is the need for that clarity and confidence in what the direction, pace, and scale of change is going to be. We believe that creating ambition loops needs to be a central part of the efforts over the coming 2 years as countries work to advance their own bold domestic policies, as they look to strengthen their nationally determined contributions and develop their long-term deep decarbonization strategies. As we've said, fortunately, evidence of ambition loops can be found around the world, and this paper looks at emerging business leadership in these 3 sectors with examples of the types of policies that countries have pursued and implemented to drive that action. The ambition loop recognizes that leadership in both spheres is critical on both sides, and examples in the paper include bold renewable energy targets in India, clear rules for power purchase agreements in Europe, mandates and incentives for electric vehicles in Norway and California, clear financing for electric buses in China, and new partnerships for transparency in the cocoa supply chains in Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, and a number of other examples, with clarity and confidence emerging each time as essential in government's efforts to accelerate action. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Elliot Metzger from WRI, who led the research team for the Ambition Loop report, and he's going to walk us through a few of the examples that you can find within the research.
All right. Thank you, Jen, and thanks everyone for joining today. We're going to call on those that are on the line here in a minute and ask if you have any ideas, examples of ambition loops. I mean, this is not an exhaustive list. This is a number of illustrative examples, some stories that we found that were compelling demonstrations of what's possible with an ambition loop. And I think they're meant to inspire more, and really the purpose of this paper is to prompt more of that interaction, that push between business and government to go faster. We all recognize that we need to accelerate these trend lines, and you may recognize this trend line. This is essentially a snapshot of the uptick in corporate renewable energy purchasing over the last several years. And you've probably seen this in headlines. You've probably seen some of the big purchases that companies have made to buy renewable energy. There's coalitions forming. One of the more prominent ones is RE100. Number of companies that are committing to buy 100% meet 100% of their needs with renewable energy. And the combined demand of these coalitions is what's really, I think, the most important piece here. There's this collective commercial demand for renewable energy, and there are companies that are hungry to buy clean energy, and they're looking for places to do so. And in talking with a number of the companies through these workshops and research and some of the desk research that the WRI team has done, this power purchase agreement was one of the consistent themes that came through from those conversations. The idea was that the clearer and more straightforward these power purchase agreement rules are, the easier it is for the companies to make an investment in renewable energy. And there are certain countries that have already started crafting these power purchase agreements. I think the European Union just passed a package over the summer that included some clear rules on PPAs, informed and advocated for by coalitions of companies that were looking to buy more renewable energy. And you see, Europe and Middle East and Africa there in the light blue. A number of states in the United States have very clear PPA rules as well. So you start to see this correlation between what countries and what governments are able to give the clarity that the companies need to invest. And I think you talk to any of these companies that are in some of these renewable energy coalitions, they'll tell you, they're actively searching for the countries that have made it very straightforward to procure renewable energy. So that's sort of the big picture. If you go to the next slide, we were able to find a few examples of where this is happening in different countries. And one of the more interesting examples was in India. And you may be aware that India has a very bold national goal, and they want to provide every household with solar power. And that's really galvanized and sort of got the attention of different actors in India. And the state of Karnataka set their own ambitious goal to get 2 gigawatts of solar online by 2021. But to do so, they needed to tap demand from the private sector again. And there were a number of companies. There was a coalition that formed called the Green Power Market Development Group. and they were very actively looking for ways to invest in renewable energy, but the financing was very tricky. The payback periods and things that the certainty that they could pay over a 10-year period was really difficult to prove when they were doing projects with developers. So Karnataka looked at this. They experimented with a 10-year exemption for some of the variable charges that can go up and down over the time period of payback for a solar project. And that really opened the floodgates for renewable energy projects, solar projects in particular. There, you see the uptick in that bar chart, and that's after the exemption went through. Now it was a certain window, and it remains to be seen what comes next. Really curious what that next bar will look like. But the idea was that it gave them more confidence to do these projects over that long term that tailored to a solar payback. So this is one example of government and businesses pushing one another, open the door for more investment. If you go to the next slide, please, you can see this translates in other sectors as well. We looked at electric vehicles, and electric vehicles are only part of the story for low carbon, zero carbon mobility. There's a number of other solutions and things, but you really do see this similar trend line with electric vehicles, and that green line is China, and that's been a game changer. It really has been. There's been a number of announcements coming out of China, policies, mandates for what they call new energy vehicles, and that's really gotten the attention of the private sector in particular. If you go to the next slide, you'll see this is the momentum that's built up over the last several years. On the top there, those top bubbles, that's the size of the government that has made a commitment to electric vehicles. You see some early commitments from Korea, Japan, Sweden, and then you see this really massive. If you were following headlines late last year, you probably saw this almost every week. There was some government that was announcing some major electric vehicle commitment. Governments, to Jen's points about zeros and hundreds, there are governments that were saying, we're going to phase out, we're going to move on from the internal combustion engine. And that got, a lot of headlines. It also got attention from a lot of the automakers, especially when China makes a move, and that's a future growth market for these automakers. They depend on that. And so you see a number of big companies. You see Ford and Toyota, Volkswagen, Honda, General Motors is in there too somewhere. You have these really big companies that are making commitments to increase their sales of electric vehicles, increase the number of models they can offer. Various different types of commitments, but these are big players making big announcements. I think you start to see this is getting attention, and there's a momentum building here, both on the private sector side and the government side. If you go to the next slide, please. One final story, and then I'd like to hand it off for a business perspective from Iberdrola, and they have a lot of interesting insights to share. But before I wrap up, let me just say this final story from supply chains, and we have a section on land and forests. You see a lot of these commitments, and this is an interesting example of an ambition loop where there is a lot of interest and momentum, and the goal is to translate that into actual action on the ground and results on the ground. One of the more interesting stories we heard and learned about in the course of the research was in the UK, where in 2012, supported by some businesses that were advocating for this and making commitments on their own, they sought to get to 100% of their procurement from sustainable sources of palm oil. Credibly certified. There were a number of challenges that the certification gave the transparency and gave the reliability that the source of the palm oil was sustainable. The country got there, exceeding 90% by the end of 2015. And I think this is the type of momentum we need to see. Now it needs to translate into action on the ground as well. And there's a number of additional things to do there. But the transparency is key. The collaboration with the producing countries is key. There's a number of interesting insights in the paper. I encourage you to look there. But enough about the quick stories. Let me hand it off to Miguel from Iberdrola. They've been one of the more active partners in this in sharing some of their insights. Miguel, are you on? Can you take over? Miguel, I can't hear you. If you're on mute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, there you are.
Yes, okay. Thank you very much, Elliot. I am very happy to participate in this project. I think that we are now at a crossroads in the policy debate if we want to achieve Paris Agreement goals, and the timing of this report is crucial, is very important. I think we need to provide successful stories to feed ambition loops in the policy side, and this report is doing this very well. As Iberdrola, I want to provide a business perspective on climate action, a positive view, bold messages. I will focus on 3 messages that I developed in the Talanoa dialogue. We have participated during this year in the Talanoa dialogue as a very useful platform to increase ambition and to have a very engaging conversation with policymakers. Iberdrola decided 2 decades ago to invest in renewables, to provide a successful story with a strategy fully aligned with climate ambition. We have invested more than 100 billion euros in renewable generation. We have more than 30,000 megawatts of wind energy, and we will continue with this story, investing more than 32 billion euros from now to 2022 in renewables mainly and smart grids. But I don't want to be talking about Iberdrola. I want to offer some bold messages on climate ambition. The first one is that energy sector is at the root of the problem. We believe that, but it's also at the root of the solution. We have just seen in the recent reports from the International Energy Agency or even IPCC that solutions are there. Renewable energy have reduced a lot their costs. For example, solar PV has reduced more than 70% their costs from 2011. Energy efficiency solutions are growing through electric vehicles, as you have just mentioned, or heat pumps in buildings, etc. And the IPCC report gives us some important messages. The IPCC report tells us that we have the challenge to meet this 1.5 scenario, but they give us also solutions. They told us that we could achieve the goals, increasing energy efficiency, phasing out coal, ramping up renewables, electrifying end uses in transport and buildings. There are a lot of solutions that are there, and we can use them to meet goals. But unfortunately, we have technologies, we have solutions, but in some cases, policy frameworks are lagging far behind. We need more ambition in the policy side, and for this, as business community, as organizations, we have a responsibility. We have to participate in this dialogue, giving successful stories and encouraging ambition in the policy side. For this reason, I present in our submission to Talanoa dialogue some policy messages. We advocate for long-term strategies that aims to get a net zero economy by 2050. We have supported this in a lot of events and global conferences, for example, in San Francisco in September. And we think that these strategies should contain some policy guidelines. For example, targets for 2030, for 2050, some guidelines on sectors. We have to identify barriers to decarbonize different sectors, transport, buildings, and we have also to implement cross-cutting policies such as taxation. Taxation is very important to internalize in prices all the externalities, CO2 cost. Taxation should be based, we don't forget it, in the polluter pays principle. We should also promote in these strategies some arrangements to increase public-private partnerships. And we should also increase a transparent and inclusive process to develop the strategies. Dialogue between different stakeholders will be crucial to develop robust strategies. I am very happy to see that European Union yesterday presented a long-term climate strategy. The European Commission presented yesterday a quite ambitious strategy advocating for net zero emissions. This is a very important signal under the political point of view, because we as stakeholders can see that the European Commission want to engage the whole economy, the whole European economy, with climate ambition. We have been seeing the different areas of this strategy, and we see that they are optimistic about the solutions that are there, and they are optimistic about the opportunities for European economies that this strategy can bring for us. And the last point that I would like to highlight is that the huge magnitude of this challenge makes necessary to work together. We have to construct alliances, and we have to be aware of the huge opportunities that we have with climate ambitious approaches. This is more or less all I would like to tell you.
All right, thank you, Miguel. Thank you very much. And thank you to a number of the other companies, NGOs, other experts that we consulted during this project and provided inputs and insights through interviews and workshops and meetings and things. It's been very, very helpful to get different perspectives from different parts of the Ambition Loop roles. I would encourage, I'm seeing some of the questions pop up now. I think there's some very good discussion points. I would encourage folks to use that questions box to seed some of the discussion we'll have here in a minute. If you have ideas, if you have examples of additional ambition loops, any questions that you have for the speakers you've heard so far, encourage you to put some notes in there and we can get to that. We'll save some plenty of time for discussion. But let me ask my colleague David Waskow from WRI. He's the International Climate Director here. Ask him to provide us some context for what's coming up in a few weeks in Poland and how this ambition loop concept, the clarity and the confidence plays into some of the priorities at COP24. David, you want to take it away?
Yeah, great. Thank you, Elliot. So I think many view this COP that's beginning next week as in many ways the most important one since Paris, in fact. And this is the key moment to really set the Paris Agreement fully in motion and make it come to life on the ground. And I'll touch on several ways in which the COP is critically important, and also how these are relevant, I think, from a business perspective, and how it relates to the issues that we've been discussing with the Ambition Loop today. So those three areas are, first of all, the Paris Rulebook, the implementing guidelines. Secondly, ambition issues, especially headed toward 2020. And then thirdly, finance and investment issues. So first on the rule book, I think it's important to emphasize these are not rules just for the sake of rules. It's a set of implementing guidelines that are being negotiated that are going to be essential really to mobilizing action very concretely on the ground and ensuring that countries are really on track for achieving their commitments, both individually and collectively. And what the guidelines will do, what the rule book will do, is to spell out how countries communicate their climate plans, their NDCs as they're called, how they'll regularly track and report on their efforts, how they'll assess progress, including collective progress in addition to what individual countries are doing, and then how they'll strengthen action and scale up investment over time. And for businesses, there are several dimensions to this that I think are important and really relate to what we're talking about today. First of all, a strong transparency framework for reporting and reviewing what countries are doing, along with really robust rules on accounting for emissions and tracking progress. This is really quite critical in order to make sure that targets that countries have set and their actions are credible and that progress against them is clear. And that is important from a business perspective for, I think, obvious reasons, and it also produces information which can be used as input by businesses in constructing their own climate strategies and goals. Knowing what is actually happening, obviously, is quite important from a business perspective, including from an ambition loop perspective, to know where policies are headed, how they're being achieved or not, and how that sets the context for business to increase its action. Another key area is the rules for cooperation on implementation among countries, and especially market mechanisms as part of this. And those market mechanisms really can enable businesses to seek out cost-effective emissions reductions in important ways, But transparency, again, here is quite important in making sure that the ways in which accounting of the transfer of mitigation outcomes, for example, is done is quite credible. A third area to note in the rule book has to do with the communication of NDCs, and one area to look at there that's being negotiated is when those come forward. And as you may recall, the NDCs that were brought to Paris had different timeframes, some for 2025, 2030. And it's important from a business perspective to have a more aligned approach to have that cycle and that timeframe for NDCs to be something that is consistent across countries, and that will provide businesses a way to accurately calibrate their decisions across a set of globally aligned NDCs, and allow them to know what that cycle is that they're working in, and how the policies, what that cycle is for the policies that they can respond to. And the last thing I'll note is around the process for reviewing collective progress and then increasing ambition over time. And this is quite important. There's a process every 5 years laid out in the Paris Agreement, including what's called the global stocktake, a regular comprehensive assessment of challenges and opportunities. And having that be technically rigorous and with high-level political attention is critical to ensuring that the coming rounds of NDCs really reflect the highest possible ambition. And I think importantly, it really should highlight opportunities in the business world for greater action, and include inputs from business in that process. We've been going through this year a sort of proto version of the stocktake with something called the Talanoa Dialogue, an initial collective stocktaking exercise, and that has included businesses as well as subnational governments alongside countries, and it will do so at the COP as well. And I think that's been important in terms of looking at where those opportunities for increasing action will be. So that's the rule book. Let me turn for a moment to ambition and some of what needs to happen on ambition at the COP as well. We're right now in the midst of the first of the 5-year cycles under Paris, as I just referred to. And at COP24, countries have an opportunity to send a clear signal reaffirming that they'll strengthen their national climate commitments by 2020. And a key question really is having an agreement by countries at the COP that reaffirms that timeline for 2020 that was adopted in Paris, and that they will go home and do their homework, if you will, and come back with potentially stronger targets by 2020. And these should really build on the Talanoa Dialogue that I just mentioned, that stocktaking exercise, as well as things that have already been mentioned on this call, like the IPCC report. At the COP, there will be many business representatives participating in at CEO level, especially in that Talanoa process that can really spur that action going forward. And as has been highlighted on this call, the actions that governments do put into their 2020 NDCs can be quite important for business. The ways in which, for example, energy or transport or land use issues are dealt with there can be quite critical to mobilizing further business action. It's not only top-line GHG reduction targets that governments can incorporate, but these other areas as well. It can also, I think, this COP point forward to the UN Secretary General Summit next year. That will be a key moment for countries alongside businesses and subnational governments to come forward with their announcements of new commitments or the kinds of commitments that they're looking at. The last thing that I'll mention on ambition at the COP has to do with the question of long-term strategies that Miguel mentioned earlier, and I think is very much in line with what Jen talked about in terms of long-term transformation towards 100% renewable energy, for example. And the COP with those long-term strategies, like the one the EU presented yesterday, can really give a push in the right direction. The COP can really emphasize the importance of doing what the Paris Agreement invited all countries to do, which is to submit those long-term strategies by 2020. And then last but not least, finance, the perennial issue of how finance and investment flows will be available. And this is essential for fulfilling the Paris Agreement's long-term goals, because it really does make change possible on the ground. And this COP really needs to build confidence, continued confidence on investment and climate solutions, and also that countries will be able to adapt to climate impacts. As you know, transitioning to a net zero economy requires significant transformations in multiple ways, and investments essential to that task. One of the issues that is relevant for this COP is in the context of the global stocktake, looking at the question of aligning financial flows, both public and private flows, with the long-term goals of the Paris Agreement. That's something that was spelled out in the agreement, and this COP has an opportunity to really make sure that that's embedded in the process under Paris going forward. There will also be discussion of the $100 billion goal, the goal of mobilizing $100 billion annually from public and private sources. There's just a report out in the last few days on that from the Standing Committee on Finance of the UNFCCC, and there's considerable progress being made, I think, that showed, and so that will be discussed. And then lastly, the Green Climate Fund will also be, I think, high profile. Germany just committed to doubling its contribution to the GCF in the replenishment cycle that's beginning, and I think we'll see attention there. All of this is quite important, obviously, as you all know, in terms of not only the Paris Agreement context, but also being able to really mobilize the kind of action, both on the public side and, critically important, on the private side on the ground in countries. So those are three key areas to watch. There are many other things that we could also discuss happening in the COP, including just transition issues, but I'll leave it there for now and happy to take any questions that you might have. Thanks.
All right, thank you, David. Thank you much. And we're getting a lot of good questions. We're going to make sure we have plenty of time to address those. Before we do, a couple wrap-up remarks from Heidi Husko and Jen Austin. Heidi, let me hand it to you first, please.
Thanks, Elliot. So we wanted to take the opportunity and also talk a little bit about how we can put these ambition loops into action, and also with regards to the upcoming COP meeting in Katowice in Poland that David just spoke about. The great thing with the COP meetings in the recent years is that the non-state actors are really nowadays a big part of the COP meetings. And if you're not attending this COP in Poland, I really encourage you to already start to look at the accreditation and how to get involved for the next one. The COP meetings are really the place of where you can meet the decision makers and those who are part of these of drafting all these policies, and as we heard, so many of those crucial global conversations are ongoing at the COP meetings. So there is really a great opportunity for business and for other stakeholders to be present and have these dialogues also during the meetings, and of course as well on a national and local level in the lead up to that. What we wanted to show you here is some of the exciting opportunities at this year's COP where the ambition loop concept will be showcased. One is the high-level meeting on caring for climate, which happens on the 10th of December. This is a meeting by invitation only, so please do go and take a look at the participant criteria on the UN Global Compact website and read more about the event there. We are still taking registrations until this Friday, and that's when registrations close. The ambition loop will be discussed and presented at this meeting, and we will have high levels from government, from the UN, from business and civil society in a room and in a small meeting, talking about the urgency and what can be done in these dialogues that needs to happen between the stakeholders, also in the lead up to the UN Secretary General's Climate Summit in 2019 that will happen here in New York on the 23rd of September. Another great opportunity to hear more about the Ambition Loop at the COP is the so-called Industry Day. The Industry Day is part of the Global Climate Action agenda, and the Industry Day is hosted by World Business Council for Sustainable Development, and there will be a particular panel around the Ambition Loop at that event. So I really also encourage you to take part of that. Many of these meetings will also be broadcasted, so if you are not able to make it all the way to Poland, you can also follow online. And finally, I also wanted to highlight that this has been a great process to be working with 3 such big organizations to come forward with with common messaging around the importance of how business and how governments can reinforce each other. And companies like Iberdrola and the other 20 companies that we've been working closely with really have some good cases on the conversations that they are having with their policy makers. And I really encourage you to also think about how you are engaging from your business side in these policy discussions, and look forward to the Q&A in a second. There's an important role that responsible business can have in these dialogues. I think that was the main point that I wanted to make around how, on a short-term notice, we can take the Ambition Loop into action, and of course, on a long-term perspective, we hope to get many more examples of Ambition Loops. As Elliot mentioned, these are some of the illustrative examples that we see that have happened. We're sure that there's plenty of others ongoing, and we would love to have your engagement also on that. So I'll hand over to Elliot for the Q&A, and then I think Jen will summarize.
Excellent. Thank you again, Heidi. So number of questions, we're going to get to those now. And maybe, Elena, can I ask you please to reference a few of the ones that have come in, and then we can start to get some answers and discussion?
Yeah, thanks, Elliot. So one of the questions that came in asked if there are opportunities for crowdsourcing and citizen science in the Ambition Loop.
Okay, great, thanks. And I think it's a very interesting, that's an additional party to the loop when you think about the public and citizen science. Jen, any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I can jump in on that one. I think essentially, yes, I think there is, this concept of how there basically leadership in different spheres can push leadership in other spheres, and very importantly, give sort of support and confidence to policymakers who are needing to set these strong, ambitious targets. That concept really applies not only for business, and the focus of our paper here, the Ambition Loop, is to focus on specific elements of the business community, but it's something that we're seeing in a number of places this year. There's a number of these groups called Alliances for Climate Action that have been springing up and developing in key countries, which are exactly that, a multi-stakeholder grouping of people, all of whom are pushing for climate action, and all of who are looking to be in touch with governments, interact with their governments in a way that help them understand that there is support for this, that there's a lot at stake for them, and that they are working in ways in wherever it is that they are, whether they're a business, whether they're a local government, whether they're a university leader, a faith leader, a civil society group, talking about the types of actions that they're taking, and then the types of policies that would help them to go further, and that there's a real strength in bringing those voices together from a real diversity of actors. So we're starting to see that in a number of countries. I think we'll see that on display at the upcoming COP as well, and that businesses have an important role to play there, but that there's quite an important role for all actors in society to help give that backing and support to their governments at this key time.
Great. Thanks, Jen. Another question here. Are NDCs the vehicle for investment for businesses?
If I can take that one also quickly. So NDCs are the nationally determined contributions that countries have put forward. When the Paris Agreement was agreed in 2015, that first round of NDCs was put forward. What those contain is indications of the targets and plans that countries have to take the first step towards the overarching goals of the Paris Agreement. I wouldn't say that they're explicitly a vehicle for investment per se, but what they are is one of the key highly visible signals that governments put forward that give that clarity and confidence, and so to businesses and others to take action. So they are a critical tool, a critical piece of the policy landscape, I would say, you know, and David referred to a few as well. There's domestic policy that countries are working on every day and the implementing details there, and then these nationally determined contributions are what they bring to the global stage when they come to a COP or when they come to the UN process, where they come to meet with other countries and make a commitment as to what they plan to do. And so the more clear and ambitious, and basically clear and ambitious that those NDCs are, the more confidence and information businesses have to inform their investment decisions. So we have heard directly from a number of the businesses throughout the course of this research talking to us, saying specifically how they do definitely look at those NDCs as an important source of information to inform their planning.
Yeah, thanks, Jennifer. And Miguel, any thoughts on that as well?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Oh, okay. Very happy to give you some inputs on our vision on NDCs. I think that NDCs are a very important signal for investors. In fact, we are looking at all this process that is about to start on NDC revision. We would like to see new goals, more ambitious goals. We would like to see, as I have said in my intervention, some signals in the taxation side, some environmental taxation reforms, some signals in the sectorial pathways to encourage sectorial reforms to eliminate barriers to decarbonization. For example, we should see some signals for investments in new infrastructure in the transport sector, for electrification, for new services. So it is very important to look at NDCs, of course.
Great, thank you, Miguel. Another question here asks, do you have a sense of which countries will be stepping up their ambition in their next round of NDCs as pertains to power, EVs, deforestation, that would enable businesses to make commitments or step up their ambition? If so, which countries, and do you have a sense of what those commitments or accelerated ambition might be? David.
This is David. I'm happy to jump in on that. I think it's still somewhat early days to know which countries are going to put those kind of policies into their NDCs. We've been seeing increased attention to those issues in policy globally, clearly, and lots of movement on electric vehicles, for example. And I think that the question over the course of this coming year will be, in fact, what countries are prepared to do on those issues, as well as many others. One of the key moments that I think we're headed toward is the UN Secretary General Summit in September next year that I mentioned. That will be a moment when many countries will have an opportunity at leader level to announce what they're intending to do in their NDCs, perhaps only in broad brush terms at that point. They won't likely be submitting the detailed versions of the NDCs until sometime in 2020. But they can, at that point, emphasize that they want to tackle transport or electric vehicles, for example, in their NDCs. And I think one task that's important across a range of sectors and issues is, in fact, to be dialoguing for the private sector, among others, to have dialogues with national governments over the course of the next months about those kind of opportunities that can be addressed in the NDCs and perhaps announced at the summit next September. And one thing to add just on that is I think it's possible for that to be announcements that not only come from governments, from leaders standing by themselves, but perhaps leaders standing together with business. So one can imagine heads of state with CEOs on a platform announcing that they will work together to achieve certain kinds of outcomes, perhaps even in NDCs.
Great, thank you, David. Next question. Did you find that these ambition loop examples are accelerating climate action at a level that the science demands? If not, how can we ensure business action reaches that level?
This is Elliot. I can jump in there with something that hasn't come up yet in discussion, but really should, and that is the number of science-based targets that companies are setting. I think we're approaching 500 at this point of companies that have committed to set their own targets at a level based on what the climate science is telling us is necessary to reduce. And you know, that's a really important signal from the private sector that, look, they're judging themselves based on what the climate science demands. And I think we need to see, you know, the whole purpose of this ambition loop concept is to see that action translate into governments that are setting those types of targets. And I don't know that anyone's really gotten there yet. I think that the question's a good one. I think what we're seeing, like for electric vehicles, for example, I mean, that trend line's impressive, right? There's a lot of growth, but it's still very small compared to how many traditional cars are being sold and are on the roads, and those will stay on the roads probably for an extended period. So there's a lot more to do, a lot more quickly to get on track with the climate science. And the IPCC report on 1.5 really was a stark reminder of how much faster we have to go. So I don't know that there's anything that is at that level yet. And in fact, there's very few countries that I think have created their NDCs that are at a level that really meets that demand. So that's part of what we're trying to get here is acceleration. I don't know if anybody else has thoughts on that too, but I don't know that in the research we saw anything that was at that level.
Great, thank you, Elliot. Another great question here. What's the interplay between ambition loops and the TCFD, that's Task Force for Climate Related Financial Disclosures, and the TCFD recommendations?
Hello, I think this relationship, this question is quite relevant because TCFD represents a very important framework to align investments, decisions, and governance in the business sector with climate ambition. TCFD recommendations, as you know, set a lot of elements to include indicators on how investments can provide a special mitigation on CO2, can provide decision processes within companies with a robust alignment with climate action. So we think it's quite important. In Iberdrola, in fact, we identified this importance 2 or 3 years ago. And last year, with this process just launched, we committed to implement all these recommendations in less than 3 years. So we are fully committed with this, and we are convinced that TCFD recommendations are key to meet climate ambition.
Yeah, and also this is Heidi. I also want to reinforce the importance of that question, and the ambition loop concept that we have presented here is looking at the business and government and how they can advance. But surely, as Miguel has just reinforced, the importance of investors in these dialogues is of course as well crucial and the key to how we come together with bolder actions and bolder policies. So it is really all interlinked, and that is the great development that we've seen in the last few years, and particularly after the Paris Agreement, how the TCFD recommendations are also, making big changes as well across investors and business practices as well.
Great, thank you, Heidi and Miguel. So we have a few questions here that I'm going to ask together. So one asks, in the US, where the federal government is not leading, what is the role for the private sector to lead? And another similar question asks, how are businesses interacting with growing subnational initiatives, such as C40, states like California, especially after the Global Climate Action Summit?
This is Elliot. I can take a first stab and welcome others to chime in too. I think there's a couple good examples of where there are subnational efforts that either because of their demonstrating a new concept or because of how big the market is. Like California, for example, it's subnational, but it's it's a major player in terms of the size of the economy. And we certainly saw with electric vehicles, when China made their policy, they modeled it after some things that California had started. With electric vehicle mandates. So there's a lot that I think you can do at the subnational level that can spur ambition loops and inspire others to make their own policies that accelerate investment. I'll point to something else too, the America's Pledge work where you saw sort of the rise of cities and other non-state actors, the subnational actors that were stepping up into an absence of leadership. I think you see that in the U.S., but also elsewhere, and there's other subnational efforts. I think in the paper we highlight, for example, the carbon pricing work that British Columbia did in Canada, and some of the things that followed in the learnings there. I think really important laboratories, state policy laboratories, are seen around the world. So I think that those are some examples. I think there's probably a lot we can do here to encourage the private sector to be sort of the pollinator, and they can bring what's working in certain markets, because these guys they cross boundaries, right? These companies are operating often in multiple countries, and they see things that are happening at the subnational level all the time. I've seen a number of companies that have been really good, like Iberdrola and others, that have brought those lessons from one country to another. So anyways, some initial thoughts there.
Okay, thanks. So we are coming up on time. I don't know if we have time for another question.
And maybe we need to wrap up. If you haven't had your question answered, apologies. There's a lot of good ones in there. If you want to reach out to anybody you heard from today, I think any of the folks and the WI research team are happy to answer things on our side. But thanks, Yelena, for walking through that. Jen, do you want to take us home?
Yeah, thanks, Elliot. Thank you, guys. Thanks, everyone on the line. We appreciate all the questions and interaction as well. Thank you, guys, for joining us to hear about the Ambition Loop report. Obviously, we encourage you to check it out and read some more details of these examples. We've got representatives, I think, from both business and governments and other actors on the line, and everybody does have a role to play in driving this Ambition Loop. So if there's one thing that you remember about this Ambition Loop, it's about the positive feedback between leadership in business and then leadership in bold policy action, which in turn accelerates further action on both sides. And from the business perspective, the real key ingredient there is clarity and confidence. So again, thanks you all for participating. If you guys are at the COP, let us know. Haiti mentioned some events there. Also happy to be in touch and hear from you guys beyond the COP. There are important conversations to be had in Capital to continue to drive this Ambition Loop forward. So we appreciate everybody's time today. And with that, we will close and end today's call.